Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Coordinating Services for TANF and Child Welfare Families. I'm James Butler with the Office of Family Assistance, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. As you may know, only a small percentage of TANF families are involved in the child welfare system. A large portion of child welfare families have received or are eligible for TANF benefits. Coordination between TANF and child welfare programs can increase access to financial assistance, employment assistance, and parenting support. We are excited to bring to you a panel of expert presenters who will share how their local TANF and child welfare programs collaborate through strategic partnerships, data integration, coordinated case management, and kinship provider support systems. During today's webinar, it is our hope that you will better understand the intersections between current and eligible TANF and child welfare families. Consider the value of partnerships between TANF and child welfare programs to improve outcomes for families, and how you can explore various approaches for creating partnerships between TANF and child welfare programs. We are very fortunate to have a variety of speakers with expertise on this topic who will guide our conversations today. Before you hear from them, we have asked Liliana Hernandez, a child welfare program specialist here in the Administration for Children and Families, to share some opening remarks. After hearing from Liliana, you will then hear from Gerard Wallace, Director at the New York State Kinship Navigator program. Among many of his other duties as director, Gerard serves as a public service professor at the University of Albany School of Social Welfare, co-chair of the New York City KinCare Coalition, and has also written and presented extensively on kinship care policy and practice. Following Gerard, you will hear from Deborah Northberg and Holly Morales with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. Deborah currently serves as the Director of Child and Family Services at Cook Inlet Tribal Council and has been with the organization for more than 15 years. In her role at CTC, Deborah has worked closely with the local Child Protection Office in various shared initiatives for Alaska Native and American Indian children in the state system. Holly Morales currently serves as the Director of Employment and Training in CTC and has been with the organization for more than 20 years. In her role at CTC, she implements a variety of programs in addition to CAS assistance that include workforce development for adults and youth, as well as tribal vocational rehabilitation. To view the PowerPoint slides in full screen, just click on the icon with the 4 arrows pointing to the corners in the upper right-hand corner of the PowerPoint slide. You can use the Q&A pod at the right to send a question for the presenters. If your question is for a specific presenter, please indicate the presenter when you enter your question. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best to address all of the questions during the Q&A portion of our webinar. We also will have a series of polling questions that will appear on your screen at certain points of the webinar. Please answer each by clicking on the radio button next to your selected response. Doing so not only helps us guide the discussion, but will also share additional information that may inform your practice. Please feel free to use the chat pod at the bottom right of your screen if you need any technical assistance. So without further ado, Liliana, if you would please.
Hello everyone, my name is Liliana Hernandez and I'm a Child Welfare Program Specialist in the Children's Bureau within the Administration for Children and Families. And I'm glad to have this opportunity today to talk to you about child welfare and TANF coordination. As you know, there's if we look at my first slide, an overlap in families served. There's a strong correlation between poverty and child maltreatment. And there are many child welfare families that have received TANF or are eligible to receive TANF services. and the coordination of services is important for improving family outcomes. Next slide. When we speak about promoting TANF and child welfare collaboration, the Children's Bureau previously funded 20 Family Connection discretionary grantees that had a Kinship Navigator component, and 7 were specifically focused on improving coordination between child welfare and TANF to assist kinship children who might be at risk of entering the child welfare system. You'll be hearing from Gerard Wallace, who's the director of the New York project, who also was one of our previous grantees. The grantees focus on increasing awareness of the TANF child-only grants as one public benefit available to kinship families, and Kinship Navigators assisted kinship caregivers in applying for and receiving TANF. And there is a link to the cross-site evaluation report of these grantees. Next slide. Some examples of TANF collaboration. I wanted to highlight one of the projects, which is the Children's Home Inc. out of Tampa, Florida. The program, some of the main program components where they had peer-to-peer navigators. They had kinship caregivers themselves who served as the navigators, and they conducted home visits with kinship families, and they had a laptop, and they were able to assist the caregiver with the online application for the TANF grant. And the study found that the peer-to-peer navigators had the highest TANF application rate at a rate of 75%, and their enrollment rates were 53%, compared to the usual care child welfare services that are available in Tampa, which had a lowest TANF application rate at 19% and enrollment rates of only 6%. So we really found that in this particular study, by having the kinship caregivers who were peer navigators themselves really knowledgeable and understanding, and them being able to explain to other kinship families who are usually grandparents or other aunts or uncles or relatives of the children that they were raising, the benefits that they would be able to receive if they applied for the TANF grant. That was a strong impetus to make sure that families would be able to stick with the process and do the online application. The Children's Bureau has a contract with ICF that runs our childwelfare.gov gateway, and we have, through that contract, created a podcast where we interviewed the director of the Children's Home Inc. in Tampa, Florida. So I've provided for you a link to the website where you can find that podcast, and there's another podcast of one of the other projects in California, which was called the iFoster 211 United Way, which really looked at an online kinship navigator model. And so that director and evaluator are also featured on the podcast. And in the next slide, I just wanted to highlight for you some other Kinship Navigator program resources. We're moving into May, and for National Foster Care Month, we are focusing on relatives. So here is a website link. And then there, as I mentioned, there's various kinship care resources on our Child Welfare Information Gateway. And the gateway also has a section that has guides and handbooks that list some state examples around the country of kinship care programs and Kinship Navigator programs for caseworkers. And now I'll pass it back to James.
Thank you, Liliana. And as promised, before you should see on the screen your first polling question for the course of the webinar. And we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that polling question before we move forward with our first presenter. So, does your TANF program currently partner with the Child Welfare Program to coordinate services and benefits? Okay, we'll give you a couple more seconds before we move on. Okay, great. Looks like the majority have a yes so far. So thanks everyone for your responses. We will now turn the presentation over to Gerard Wallace. Gerard?
Thank you. I'm Gerard Wallace. I'm from New York State. I work out of the Capitol. I run the Kinship Navigator. You can go. I'll just say next for the next screen. Okay. Our program provides information, referral, and advocacy. I'm also a public service professor. I've been doing kinship law and policy since the late 1990s, and certainly kinship's care, its time has come. It is now really at the forefront of child welfare practice, and we're really glad to see that the Family First Act and the Omnibus Bill are going to provide some funding for kinship navigators. Next. All right, I think just to go over quickly who the kinship population is. Nationally, 2.7 million kinship caregivers. I think we all know most of this, but it's interesting to highlight that it's only 65% of grandparents are the caregivers. The grandparent number has decreased from 80 to 65% over the past 15 years, and that means there's more aunts and uncles and what they call fictive kin. And as you know, some of the policies being created are expanding the definition of kinship and who can get services to include even non-blood caregivers. That's important to understand. High rates of disabilities for the caregivers. Of course, they're older. They're 56 years of age, and many of them are retired on fixed incomes. Next. And that leads to issues for the caregivers providing adequate care and highlights why they need these services. Now, kinship care really grows out of the child welfare system, and if you look at the causes of kinship care, and by here I mean any kinship family, whether they're in the child welfare system or on their own, the causes are very similar. Abuse, neglect, abandonment, same reasons that you have in neglect or abuse or a child dependency proceeding. Alcohol, substance abuse, certainly highlighted now with the opioid crisis. Here in rural New York, we have 40 rural counties in this state, hard to believe. They're devastated. It's very, very difficult. Lily's calling in from West Virginia right now. We all know how bad it is out there. The parents can be deceased. Mental illness is a big issue. Sometimes they're just unwilling to parent, and that's really unfortunate. I like to talk about mathematics because why do we have this surge of kinship care over the past 3 decades? Well, one reason is we have less two-parent families. We have over 50% of our parents are now single, and if you half the number of parents, you've doubled the risk of getting to zero, no parent. Just to highlight a little more why kinship care, any kinship family, is similar to families in child welfare. In our federal project, we were able to mine data from 5 upstate counties, and looking at 449 children who were served in our project, 86% of them had Child Protective Services records. None of them were in foster care. Next. And then, of course, the reality of this is even more severe when you look at the circumstances of the children. I'm sure everybody's aware of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. There's another study by the federal government called Adverse Family Experiences. And here, just going through the bullets on your far left, you can see some of the disproportionality and severity of the situation for these children. Starting at the top, 1.5 times as likely to be in a household that can't afford basics, 5 times as likely mental illness in the household, 6 times as likely neighborhood violence, 15 times caregiver or parent violence, 11 times drug and alcohol, and 17 times more likely to have a parent or caregiver incarcerated. These are families that come from crisis situations. The children have high levels of trauma and loss. Next slide, please. All of this is just to point out why it's really important to get them to services. And but to go through the profile a little further, this is from our federal project also. The circle on the right in dark blue and light blue are the number of families that were below the poverty level. That's 36% of the kinship families in these 5 upstate counties. And on the left, you can see once again that the proportion of grandparents is not that high. Here it's 62.9%. Next slide, please. Yet, I have been doing this for 20 years, and the skepticism about kinship families when I first began was big. Didn't have to go far to hear the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Yet that's proven by statistically and by big studies not to be the fact. And some of the reasons it's not the fact is that kin are better equipped to provide help. Their emotional support, placement stability, less recidivism, less going back into foster care, the sense of family identity and all the associated family values that go with it, and keeping kids together. And what's not on screen is the paramount virtue of a kinship family, which is the unconditional love of a caregiver who will walk through water. And I'm going to plug my film at the end, and you ought to go watch it because it really exemplifies how great these caregivers are. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, so that's their situation. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I look at their needs, and I see all sorts of barriers. This slide just mentions a few of them. There's a wonderful article written in 2008 that's entitled, "We Have No Rights, We Get No Help," which summarizes at least the perception of kinship families about how bereft they are of assistance and really just emphasizes the need to get them whatever services we can get. Now, access to the TANF child-only grant, paramount for impoverished families, the first thing we have to make sure happens. Access to child welfare services or foster care when needed. The line about who gets into foster care and who doesn't is a difficult subject area, but our program and child welfare folks are working to increase the amount of relative placements in foster care, and that's a national effort that's going on. Access to legal assistance, not often mentioned, but legal assistance is crucial. They're going for custody orders. They're going for guardianship. They have an administrative decision against them to get benefits. Legal help is really important. And then there's a whole range of case management kind of services that can support them and increase outcomes, respite, parenting skills, trauma for the children, and then support groups which really provide a lot of solace. All those are kind of the things that kinship services that we need to be getting these families to. Next, please. Just to emphasize that child-only grant, often called a non-parent grant, in a 2012 study by Chapin Hall, only 12% of eligible families nationally are getting the grant. There's a lot more work to be done in the handoff from child welfare to the public assistance arena to make sure that when child welfare gives children to caregivers and they don't become foster parents, that they get to these benefits. I'll sum it up. Child Protective Services gave me my grandson 8 years ago. This is the first time I've found out there's help. Got to end that. There are other barriers to getting this grant that folks on the TA side would be aware of. I mentioned them here briefly because us as a service provider for the kinship community are really, really invested in getting these, climbing over these barriers and getting people this grant. The application itself, sometimes the terminology is wrong. We just had a case here in Albany where the caregiver asked for the wrong grant. A year and a half was told it didn't exist. She won retroactive payments. Dedicated staff, if you can have a dedicated person for these child-only grants, you will really, really increase the value and the opportunity for families to get them. And, of course, the eligibility requirements are just go on and on. Next slide, please. On the child welfare end, just to kind of frame it up, in 2008, the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, which funded these Kinship Navigator demonstration grants, also talked about the notification and opportunity for kin to become caregiver foster parents. And in doing that, the federal law said you must notify relatives, including all the grandparents. You must do it within 30 days, and you must do it in writing. Yet we still have states where this is an issue and where the information is not given adequately or with the sufficient kind of opportunity to understand what your options are. Another part of that child welfare law was kinship guardianship programs, which are a way out of foster care to get a subsidy. Makes it even more valuable for kin to become foster parents and get that grant. Next slide, please. All this is by way of framing up what the issues are and why it's important to get people to services. Now, the Kinship Navigator program, which I run, I'm a statewide program, 62 counties in New York State. We do have local kinship services in 22 counties, case management style programs, similar to what Liliana described that Larry Cooper is doing in Florida. But ours is an INR program. We provide information, referral, education, and advocacy. Our information on our website, extensive legal fact sheets that are cited law for self-advocacy, extensive resources of anything that is in any way close to a kinship service provider. We have a helpline during business hours. Our referrals, it's really important to get people to the local programs or to any little support group or any kind of mom and pop shop out there. We do a lot of education. This past year, myself and two other staffers did 120 presentations across the state. Outreach, outreach, outreach. Finding, identifying, and getting to these caregivers is not easy. On our website, we also have online videos of our presentations and how-to guides for making out the application for benefits. And we do advocacy on a state level and on a case-wide level and work to help build collaborations, task force across the state. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, we have this demonstration project, and in it, we did an evaluation with the State SUNY Center for Human Services Research. We implemented a permission to contact procedure. That's what I really want to talk about. And we worked with local departments to identify their challenges to services and to help train them and to sensitize their staff to the different kinship issues. Next slide. All right, the permission to contact procedure. In a one-year period, we increased from 49 referrals from these 5 upstate counties, departments of social services, on the child welfare side and on the public benefits side. We increased from 49 to 428 referrals using this procedure. People stopped falling through the cracks. It's one thing if we're lucky enough that folks in the department are giving them information about kinship services. It's another thing whether they actually use that information. Here are the target population. On the public benefit side, if they're coming in for a public assistance grant or other services or SNAP, and you folks can identify them as a kinship family, you want to get them to that services. On the child welfare side, as mentioned earlier, you may be giving children to a caregiver and they're not going to be a foster parent. It happens all the time. You may not even start a removal or a procedure, a neglect procedure, but they get the children informally, what's sometimes called parole or a safety plan. If you start a procedure and you're in family court, it may convert it into a private custody or guardianship, or you may have some kind of hybrid situation where kin get the children but don't become foster parents. It don't matter. There's lots of different ways that people skin the cat, but in all those situations, those kinship families, narrowly speaking, are informal, and you need to get them to any of the services available in the county. That's the permission to contact procedure. How does that work? Next slide, please. All right. Well, first we had to negotiate it. We talked to senior management. We got buy-in. We explained that we would do trainings. We looked to get some data sharing. We talked to them about what the permission to contact procedure would be and how we had to get folks to do it. And we asked for assistance and outreach. In one instance, we had a mailing to public benefit recipients who were kinship caregivers over the past 2 years, and then got folks in touch with us via that. Next slide. Okay. This is the holy grail for us, the one that increased so greatly by over 600% our numbers. A one-page form, front and back. On one side, it was just, hi, this is the Kinship Navigator. We want to be in touch with you. Please turn the form over and fill it out. The caregiver could be talking to a benefit person or a child welfare person. Could be a family finder. It could be somebody in CPS. And they would give them this form, say, make it out, and we'll get you to these Kinship Navigator services. The caregiver would fill out the form, indicate, it's a little tiny on screen here, when they wanted to be contacted, day or night, and there's a box down here where you could fill in information about the staffer who did it, and what department they're in. That form was then left in the office, and every few days, we did them in blue so that we didn't lose the paper. Every few days, somebody in the office would scan that form or email them or fax them to us. I guess fax or scan, right? Next slide, please. We got in touch with that family within 2 business days. We had a 95% closing the loop, and that's how the numbers went so high. The implementation really was so successful because we worked at it. How did we work at it? Our research team first went in and did some focus groups, and I remember the evaluator coming out and saying, they won't do it. It's more work. They don't want more work. Obviously, folks are overworked, understaffed. They don't want more work. We also understood from those focus groups that many child welfare folks did not understand the child-only benefit, and they were not telling people about it, even though in some buildings they were in offices across the hall. We then talked with senior management, laid out a plan of implementation, got buy-in with middle-level management. That's a tough lift sometimes. We did some trainings on kinship issues in which we showed them the range of issues that I alluded to earlier with much more depth to let them understand that these kinship families really did face barriers. Then we did training on how to do this, sign out on the form, cajole them to get it. It's all done over in 3 or 4 minutes, stack them in the office, and get them to us. And we offered some incentives. If you wanted to identify who made out the form, you got a free Dunkin' Donut card or a mug. Once a month, we let folks know what was going on. And then over the course of the year, things would falter. We watched to see if there was getting to be any slack, and we went back in, did other trainings, or met with management and kind of incentivized them to continue going. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, when we did trainings, I mentioned the resistance. I particularly want to talk about Child Protective Services. Very tough job, and yet in many instances, not all kids are going to wind up in foster care who they've identified as possibly needing to get out of the parent's home. This is a critical matter where we want to be sure folks don't fall through the tracks. On the TANF side, most of the workers are more familiar with kinship families and are meeting them in a more sunny setting, so to speak, and they had a more receptive idea of wanting to use this, okay? But we got the buy-in in the trainings, particularly the child welfare folks recognized the value. And one of the values was if they were cutting them loose, they weren't cutting them loose and not getting them to someone who was going to be involved with them. So even though it might just be in the case management notes, to feel that we're continuing to serve them, that was a good thing for the case worker. They were very happy about. Next slide, please. All right, I got a couple more minutes, and I'll just mention here that not only did we do outreach via this referral process, but we held convenings in the counties, child welfare folks and TANF folks and their management came in and reached out to other agencies, nonprofits. We got together and formed task force. We held events, what we called summits, brought in speakers, and one way or another we wanted to increase awareness in the county because there are just all these organizations, all these agencies are coming across kinship families. The schools themselves, huge opportunity. Daycare, all sorts of times when we get referrals from daycare. So we took this outreach procedure and permission to contact, and not only did it with the Department of Social Services agencies, we're now using it in schools, daycare, churches, and other places. Next, please. Okay. All right. So you, as service providers on the TANF and child welfare side, are there other ways you can help us connect kinship families to services? Well, in New York State, by law, you have to advertise these grants, and how you advertise them is up to you. The website is nice, but it can be buried there. Informational material in the offices and on the walls of both the child welfare and temporary assistance offices are key. And doing your own promotion across the state to your partners is really important. Making internal referrals from child welfare directly to TA. You may, if you don't have a kinship service provider, that permission to contact form can go right over to the TA people. Maybe they could call up the family and make sure that they come in to get the benefit. And then, of course, you can make the referrals, as I've described, to a Kinship Navigator or to a local kinship program using the different techniques we're identifying here. Training. Staff, really, there are staff still who think the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree, or as they like to say in the, nobody likes to say it, the perpetuation of intergenerational dysfunctionality. Okay, see if you can remember that, okay? Interagency collaborations between the nonprofit world and the local service providers, not only on the local level but on the state level. And of course, events and forums that educate are always important. And lastly, in your service plans, identifying what your goals are for relative foster care percentages of your population and goals for your public assistance folks in a similar vein would be really important to incentivize staff and to make them realize we can do better. Next slide, please. Okay. Outreach to Kinship Families. We talked about the permission to contact form. I mentioned earlier this film. You can go to my website and see the trailer. The film is really a beautiful portrayal of a Native American, African American, and Caucasian family here in New York from the caregiver's point of view. Totally, really their words. It's not stylized, and it's inspirational. And for caregivers and for workers, it humanizes terrifically. We have been promoting September as Kinship Care Month, Kinship Caregiver Month, and that has been a U.S. Senate resolution, and 9 states have done it. And in New York every year in the capital and around the state, we have celebrations, awards, luncheons, and it really helps promote awareness of that issue. And I think I'm almost done. Next slide. All right, I'm done, and I hope I've helped. If you have any questions, I will hang around and answer them. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Gerard. So before you now, you should see on the screen our next polling question. What types of additional support can your TANF families receive as a result of a strong collaboration with your child welfare program? And you can check all that apply. So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that one before we move on to our next presenter. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your responses. So we'll now move on to Holly and Deborah.
Good morning. My name is Holly Morales. Well, actually, it's probably afternoon in some places. I have here with me Deborah Northberg, and we'll take the opportunity to take turns and tell you about the services that we have here at Cook Inlet Tribal Council. Next slide. This is a picture of the building that we are in here in Anchorage, Alaska. We're a tribal nonprofit organization. We assist mostly Alaska Native and American Indian people of all cultures that reside in the Cook Inlet region located in South Central Alaska through a variety of impactful and innovative programs and services that empower our people. Next slide. This is a picture of our service area for Cook Inlet Tribal Council. In Alaska, we're a little bit different than what we call the lower 48. We don't have reservations except for one. Our service area is a designated area that we can provide services. It's called the Cook Inlet region. Like I mentioned earlier, we are in Anchorage, Alaska. The population is around 300,000. Anchorage is right in the middle of the green service area. And so the green area is the service area, and it's the with the northernmost point 140 miles north of Anchorage and the southernmost point 255 miles. If you see Anchorage and above Anchorage in the green area is where this particular grant is servicing. Some of the communities that we have are inaccessible by road. For example, the village of Tyonek, that's to the left of Anchorage, on the western boundary of the region, lies across the Cook Inlet and can only be reached by bush plane. Also, traveling south to the village of Soldovia requires to drive 4.5 hours and then taking a 10-minute flight over the Kachemak Bay. Next slide. Our values at Cook Inlet Tribal Council, the first one is we are interdependent. We trust one another and work as a team towards our common goals. We recognize that each of us has an equally important role in the community and that we're stronger together as individuals. Our next value is we are resilient. We look to the future with steadfast optimism, hope, and faith in our people. We engage in solutions and endure adversity with courage. Our next value is accountability. We're reliable. We work with integrity and lead by example. We honor our obligations and correct our mistakes. Our last value is respectful. We treat one another with dignity and kindness. We value and embrace our diversity, respect ourselves, and understand our boundaries. You can see there from our vision that we focus a lot on our youth, so the stewards of our future, and a lot of our services are geared towards youth-driven to recognize the potential that they have. Next slide. So I'll go over a little bit about, as an organization, what we do. I think it's important to give you a full picture of all the services that we provide. And all the services really help us to see where we can collaborate further beyond this current grant we have. Like I said before, we are a tribal nonprofit organization. We serve Alaska Native and American Indians. Our services are broken out between 4 core departments. Educational services, which focuses more on youth services. Employment and training services, which is where I work, and child and family services, and recovery and reentry services. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. As an organization, we have over 50 programs and services, more than 11,500 individuals that we served last year, and our annual budget is more than $65 million, and we employ approximately 275 passionate and caring individuals. Next slide. Okay. So the first department that I'll talk about is the education department. We have achieved a 93% graduation rate in the services provided at Cook Inlet Tribal Council, as compared to 57% among the Anchorage School District Alaska Native and American Indian students. The overall percentage for the school district is 76%. Our high school programs operate within the Anchorage School District, our CITC's longest running youth program. We've expanded its culturally informed STEM skill building programming to an additional 580 middle school students last year. And nearly 2,000 plus students were served last year in the youth services department. We also currently this week are hosting the Native Youth Olympics, which are traditional games taught within school districts across Alaska. CITC hosts an annual competition, and that brings in more than 1,000 plus students from across the state of Alaska. Next slide. Recovery services they provide comprehensive treatment to assist individuals within all stages of recovery from substance abuse or addiction. It includes assessments, detox, individual and group counseling, and help in assessing and increasing support through a peer-to-peer network to maintain sobriety. The director is always talking about their peer-to-peer services and how every person that receives services is always impacted by peer-to-peer and have access to peer-to-peer services. They served over 1,400 individuals throughout outpatient, residential, peer support, and reentry services last year, and 79% of detox participants reported no use after 12 months. 62% indicating access to stable housing 6 months after treatment. And then our Sean Loop program served 22 new individuals, which is a self-sustaining program that self-sustains through micro-enterprises. It's mirrored after a program in California called Delancey Street. Next slide. Self-sufficiency. This is our Employment and Training Services Department to highlight a few of our accomplishments. We had over 700, and we assisted over 700 participants getting employed last year, and $9.41 average hourly wage increase from when they entered our door. More than 400 plus participants moved from welfare to work, and over 1,700 children were receiving our services through the Child Care Assistance Program. Through our Health Professions Opportunity Grant that we received through ACF, we assist with medical coding and billing training, LPN, RN, CNA, PCA. We had over 135 students enrolled last year, and we graduated 53 students in healthcare careers. Next slide. So the next one is Children and Families. That's the department Deborah works in, and it is dedicated to promoting safe, secure, and healthy families who learn new skills to improve relationships and establish healthy behavioral practices. They help families recover from and or prevent abuse, neglect, and domestic violence through case management, teaching, and mentoring services. They served over 400 families engaged through their reunification services last year, 86 individuals enrolled in their healthy relationship classes, 56 families enrolled in family preservation programs, and we do have a new program, and last year they served 49 children in our Early Head Start Center. It's a very new and exciting. They have a brand new renovated building. It's absolutely beautiful for our little ones. Next slide.
Good morning and afternoon. My name is Deborah, and why collaboration? We've long since been aware in our tribal TANF program that there are families who have multiple barriers and needs who are receiving our TANF services. We've recently conducted a community needs and readiness assessment for another grant-funded project, and highlighted this study that was done by Gerard and others to help us describe what the data says about our population served. And so the study asked, how much does each of these factors increase the risk of a family being involved in child protection? The data that the study used is the Alaska Surveillance of Child Abuse and Neglect epidemiological data. Next slide, please. So factors that increased involvement with child protection, the three factors that were most significant were, of course, public aid as a source of family income. We understand the relationship between the toxic stress of poverty and child protection involvement. There also seems to be a factor of increased surveillance of people as compared to others in the community when you are receiving your income from a public aid system. Our mothers are generally younger than the rest of the Anchorage population, and the other odds ratios for factors around incarceration and homelessness are particularly acute for our population. Next slide. The other factors for involvement that are more recently significant for our community are the use of opioids and other drugs. The state of Alaska was delayed in this particular epidemic. It's certainly become a factor, particularly within the last several years. and increasing the need for collaboration. The other factor, as was mentioned before, is the high rate of cases in our population. In addition, the rates of homelessness and incarceration and other adult acute or chronic traumas impact our population, as well as historical trauma. Next slide. So as Holly mentioned, CITC is particularly well positioned to collaborate among critical services for families who receive TANF and are at risk of child welfare involvement. It's important to note that CITC does not have care and authority responsibility for children in our region, but we partner with the state child protective services system and work hand in hand for our population. We sought funding to improve our collaboration in 2006. Our first grant was entitled the Agency Without Walls, and this was an ACF grant geared towards TANF and child welfare collaboration. We see this really as our exploratory and infrastructure phase of our collaboration process. First, we sought to match data across our data systems within our services that we provide. We focused on 3 core service areas: our Tribal TANF program, our Child and Family Services program, and our Recovery Services program. And we discovered, of course, that we had many participants in common across the systems. We endeavored to describe the outcomes of participants who were involved in 3 programs, and noted in this project that those participants did better on post-ratings of the North Carolina Family Assessment Scale, particularly on the domains of parental capacity and child well-being. Concurrently, we sought to rethink our leadership structure. In this process of looking at an agency without walls and increasing collaboration, we flattened our leadership structure and created a President's Council and a CITC Leadership Council. The function of these 2 groups was to, in real time, address issues that directly impacted the provision of services to families. The CLC Leadership Council included not just direct service directors that are our 4 core service areas, but also included directors of accounting and MIS and IT, and facilities and HR. The goal was to determine which decisions could be best served by developing a process for consensus building across the organization and soliciting information that was really necessary in making better decisions on behalf of the organization. The other milestone that occurred in this particular project was the development of a common intake for all programs in the organization. The goal was to create no wrong door to organizational services. And the purpose of the common application is twofold, really. First, to create ease of access for our participants, and secondly, to begin a common data set across all services that we can use for planning and continuous quality improvement. Next slide, please. We sought additional funding in 2011 and were awarded a grant, Tribal TANF and Child Welfare Grant entitled Nuku Canoe, which translates to Everyone is Family. This really was a phase in which we translated what we had learned in our first project to direct services with our participants. We began by creating some cross-department engagement and ownership, looking to create leadership at all levels of the organization. And we initiated a meeting among our tribal TANF and child and family services staff. The purpose of the meeting was to identify mutual goals and outcomes among our services, create a common language among our staff, dispel some cherished beliefs or myths that our staff had of one another and the work that we did. For example, the term case management meant very different things in our tribal TANF program and our family services program. We had conversations about accountability and enabling, and came about with a way of determining some joint outcomes that we would look at. And that laid the foundation for adopting a screening tool for all of our tribal TANF participants. We utilized a form of the protective factors survey and used this as a way to identify the families in our tribal TANF program who were most in need of services and were at risk of child abuse or neglect. We see this both as a case management tool. Implementing this with participants allows our tribal TANF staff to have conversations beyond the movement to work and looking at the whole family rather than just the efforts of the parents. And it's a tool for supervisors to coach staff in identifying needs for the families and making referrals both internal and external. We have continued to leverage this process to better understand our participants in another project by incorporating some domestic violence screening questions within our screening process for TANF participants, and have used this as a way to connect internally to services for families. In this project, we also dedicated a liaison between departments. The goal of this liaison was to increase communication between our tribal TANF and child welfare staff, and to serve as a liaison for referrals and services. This person also provided direct services, more intensive in-home case management than the TANF workers with higher caseloads were able to do. Those referrals were prioritized for families who identified themselves as having the most need through our screening process. And this provided, this tied our services to a recent change in our tribal TANF plan that allowed us to provide short-term cash assistance to parents who had child welfare, child protection placement of their children while on TANF. These parents were able to receive short-term reduced cash benefits to prevent some of the cascading consequences of having a child removed from your care, with the hope of not disrupting housing and other core services for the parents. We also implemented cross-department shared training in the child protection practice model. As I mentioned, we have a strong partnership with the state local child protection office here in Anchorage, as well as the University of Alaska Child Welfare Academy, who provides all of the training to the child protection social workers. We have implemented a practice model training and a strengthening families training, beginning with our tribal TANF and our child welfare staff, with the goal of creating a common understanding across our programs and with the child protection system about how is safety operationalized, what does it look like, what are the possibilities of aligning goals and objectives on the family self-sufficiency plan and family service plan to reduce duplication and confusion for families and to increase accountability across systems with staff and participants. Next slide, please. We translated this experience to another application for tribal TANF and child welfare collaboration and began an enhanced version of our Lukuku program, expanding the shared child welfare practice model training to our other departments, recovery services and education. What we recognized over the course of providing this training mutually to tribal TANF and child and family service staff was that there was some additional benefits of understanding what the practice model was and the process of team decision-making meetings where child placement decisions were made. And we saw an increase in the rate of our tribal TANF workers who had an established relationship with families in those meetings. It's a benefit to families for many reasons, primarily because that will initiate the short-term cash assistance from TANF post-placement, but additionally, the tribal TANF workers are able to provide information that perhaps not other workers may have, including kinship relationships. That could be a potential relative placement and reduce the rate of children going into a stranger placement. We also have endeavored to expand services within the region, and we are providing services both in the urban center and our local rural area within the Cook region. We are looking at developing a data and evaluation plan, and we've engaged an external evaluator to do so, to better understand and describe the changes as a result of the collaboration that we're doing. And we are aligning our data systems, both immediate, so that we can share at the direct staff level plan and long-range planning. We have moved through the stages of collaboration during this process. Next slide, please. Beginning at networking, before the grant funding, we had siloed services driven by funding with very little overlap. We moved to cooperation through the organized continuous quality improvement team that happened quarterly, and we began looking at data across systems. The grant funding allowed us to move into coordination, looking at our leadership structure and sustainability as a values-driven organization. And we are slowly moving through the process of coalition and collaboration. Our initiative focused planning was anchored to our data philosophy and our common intake. And we are at the point of improving our collaboration at the system level through the functions of the Leadership Council. Next slide, please. Lessons learned. We have learned through this process that collaboration is a journey, not a destination, that this process must accommodate contextual shifts such as changes in the state economy and social conditions and shifting funding priorities. Everyone is a leader across all levels of the organization. Leaders and direct staff must all be involved in the systemic and programmatic change planning. We made efforts to engage stakeholders in our sustainability planning that included staff participants, thought leaders, and partners. The process planning for changes in leadership and how that translated to direct services could have been enhanced. We know that we need to find champions of change to sustain engagement and motivation, particularly at the direct services staff level, and that the process of collaboration must be documented and evaluated to sustain progress. We need to understand what it is that we need to collect in order to tell the story of the benefits of collaboration, and are working with an external evaluator to do so now. We also recognize that the articulation of values creates the foundation to align goals, outcomes, and data. This was a part of our sustainability process and generated the 4 values that Holly spoke about at the beginning. And we learned that building collaboration creates a mindset and translatable skills that apply to other external partnerships and collective impact efforts. The result of one of those is the co-location of a contracted domestic violence victim advocacy coordinator within our tribal TANF program, contracted with our local DV shelter.
Next slide. I know that our portion is ending, or actually ended, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. But where do we go from here? Sustainability of grant-driven efforts. So we are always looking for resources in order to continue the work that we're doing and collaborating, maybe looking at existing resources and how we can realign those to keep these services going, because it's so critical for our tribal TANF families to have access to child welfare services prior to any kind of removal, trying to be more proactive instead of reactive. We're doing a strategic agency initiatives to develop a common assessment and outcome tool. That's what we're working on right now across the different departments that we talked about earlier. And we're also in the process of developing a family information system, which is a huge undertaking, and it's probably going to take about 3 to 5 years. But it's so important that our system supports the work we're doing across departments. Thank you very much. That was our presentation.
Thank you so much, Holly and Deborah. So we're going to move now into our Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you have any questions, you may submit them through the Q&A box in the upper right corner of your screen. Again, if you have questions for a specific presenter, please state that in your submission. And Stephen, do we have any questions available yet?
Yes, we have a couple. I'll start with the first one from Kristen Schumann. And she mentions that they find that one obstacle is often child care. It's expensive, and TANF dollars are not enough to cover child care expenses. And there are times when they don't qualify for child care subsidies. So she was looking for recommendations.
Well, this is Holly at Cook Inlet Tribal Council. Within the Employment Training Services Department, that's where we have the Tribal TANF program. Fortunately enough, our TANF program is able to provide 100% child care subsidy. Obviously, in Alaska, child care is expensive because of cost of living, and at times, unfortunately, the subsidy, the maximum pay amount, does not cover the entire amount. We have worked in partnership with the Luku Canoe program to figure out a long-term solution, or using supportive services at times. But unfortunately, that does sometimes mean that they will go with in-home care versus a center, which is at times higher quality care. But we also house in the same department a child care assistance program. Our TANF can do post-TANF child care services for up to 12 months, but because of funding, we can now do it for 2 months. And then we have families transition to our child care assistance program, which is subsidy based on income. I know this is a constant struggle. We have our Early Head Start program, where if they're eligible under our services, we do waive a copay, because it's a child care partnership program, so they're typically have a subsidy, but we've worked it out with our CCDF program so we can waive those subsidies for families. I think it's consistently looking at the services you're providing and how you can make changes that are allowable under the law or regulations in order to meet the needs of the family.
Thank you. And we have an additional question from Jesse Parr. And that is there any data on the number of kinship providers who did not apply for TANF benefits or become licensed foster care providers due to the federally mandated child support obligation that would accrue against their family?
Well, you hit one of the really rough topics in the child-only grant area, which is the obligation for the parents to support, and how that is a deterrent to kinship families seeking this grant. Offhand, we have our database has our number of kinship applicants, and we ask them whether they're successful in getting it. I'd have to go back and see if we have data on why they didn't, if we had categorical data on why they didn't go for it. But I know the state agency doesn't collect that data. I'd make a comment on it that in New York, one of the values of having a Kinship Navigator program in the state capital has been, for the past 18 years, that we are a partner with the legislature and with the state agencies in trying to improve circumstances for these families. And one of the things we've done is enhance the exemptions from cooperating with information about the parents for the caregivers. There's an exemption that has always been around, which is a good cause exemption for domestic violence, but we've added one that says if the caregiver or believes that they themselves or the child would be subject to emotional or physical harm, if they gave this information, they're exempt. And the other thing, and I don't know if this is federal law, but in New York State, the social services law says that the penalty for failure to cooperate with providing information about the parents is a 25% reduction in the grant. It is not an elimination of the grant. And even in New York where we have that law, again, I don't know if it's national, but we do find local departments will tell people, if you don't help us, you won't get the grant, and that's a misrepresentation of what the law says. So information can be helpful there.
All right, thank you. Unless there's additional questions, those were the two questions that we had.
And I'll just throw out one question for both Holly and or Deborah and Gerard. What was your biggest challenge in building your coordinated approach, and how did you overcome it?
My program, what I presented on today, was actually an element of the program that we thought was a key factor in not having families fall through the cracks. I mean, the service array and all that is another story, but not having families wind up in that awful example I gave you, which is a quote from a grandmother, about 8 years without services. We wanted that to happen. And when we went in to talk to the temporary assistance people, there was not much resistance there, but on the child welfare side, there was resistance, and I can sum it up in the fact that they are overwhelmed and they did not want another thing to do. And yet when we were able to explain to them the circumstances, which I kind of briefly alluded to in the presentation, and kind of humanize these families and let them see, as many of them did originally, but certainly kind of augmenting it, what a resource they were for the child welfare system and how successful they could be, that when they understood that they were not having to just let them go, so to speak, they bought into it. So it was a conversation with information and based on the goodwill of the child welfare folks who were there for the right reasons. They're there to help children.
This is Deborah. We noted many challenges throughout this process of collaboration, time and resource being the most challenging factors in moving toward a more collaborative, coordinated service. As mentioned, the sustainability planning that allowed us to come together with input and determine some shared values is something that we have used to create engagement and motivation around working together. The other most important thing is being able to demonstrate the positive impact on participants that we share when we work better together. And we recognize in our relationship with the state system, they are also very, very overwhelmed and asking the TANF workers or the Child Protection Services workers to add something else is not very effective. And so we consistently look to find efficiencies in the system and highlight any value added to their process that reduces some of their burden. It's an ongoing conversation.
Thanks to both of you. Are there other questions? Stephen?
At this point, there are no additional questions.
Okay. All right, so we can go ahead and move into our next polling question then. So as a result of today's webinar, what is one thing you will do differently to strengthen coordination with your child welfare programs? And we'll give you a few moments to reply.
First person to reply gets a free Dunkin' Donut $10 gift card.
Just one more second, and then we'll move to our final poll. Great. Thanks, everyone, for your responses. So we can go ahead and move into our final poll question. So last but not least, what topics would you like to see in future webinars? Great. Thanks, everyone. So as we begin to wrap up, you can also help us expand our network and reach a greater number of people by directing interested colleagues from your local and state networks and agencies to our website, which is showing on the screen before you. Also, as another reminder, a transcript and audio recording of today's webinar will be available shortly on the Peer TA Network website within the coming weeks. We'd also like to hear from you about future webinar topics, as we mentioned earlier, so you can send those ideas by email as well through the peerta@icf.com. At the end of the webinar, you'll see a brief survey that will launch as the webinar ends. So I'd like to thank everyone, especially our presenters, Gerard, Holly, Deborah, and Liliana, for presenting us today. And thank you all so much for participating in today's webinar. And we thank you again. So please remember to provide your feedback on the webinar survey that will appear as we end the presentation. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the remainder of your day.